Welcome back, all you cool cats and kittens. It's your Commissioner Tim Che with the Commissioner Brandon, welcoming you to our season two. About to kick off the 2022 season officially. Man, it's been a long off season, but man, we are finally ready for season two, aren't we, Brandon?
Oh, we're ready. I'm getting tired of accruing draft picks. I'm ready to get going on this season.
And hopefully, like all sort of good TV shows heading into season two, we are doing a season one wrap up with a quick sort of season two preview as well. We'll talk about season one storylines. We'll talk about the season one sort of reviews and some trades to date, and do maybe a team by team preview heading into week two. All right, so maybe with the season one recap, Brandon, I felt like by week five, we sort of had a good understanding of the tiers of the teams that were likely to make playoffs. We're probably going to be having a hard time making it in, obviously with a couple exceptions with some, wheels falling off or late spurts. But I think, by week five, I just felt like in no order, that top tier was probably Ryan, Yves, you, and Adam. And obviously that exception with Derrick Henry's injury in week 8, which sort of allowed Adam's sort of thin roster to sort of fall to pieces there. But that's essentially how I felt about the playoffs. And, I don't think I was really taken by surprise on the playoff runs. I felt like it was going to be Yves and Ryan probably at the top two as they played all regular season. I don't know if you have a different thought on the playoffs or how the regular season played out.
No, I think there were basically two themes that I took away from our first season. Really just the importance of depth. We saw the injury bug really hit a few teams hard, knock them completely out of contention and then right into the toilet bowl. And then I think it was also kind of the year of surprises and seeing some players develop quicker than maybe was expected. And I'm kind of alluding to your team here, but just some, players and teams kind of coming out of nowhere to establish themselves for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the point, so I think the playoffs, the season recap will go by team and talk about those in detail. But I felt like the toilet bowl playoffs was a bit of a shock.
Was a bit of a shock. Yeah, I think just the biggest surprise is Adam's team, obviously. Going from that playoff contention tier to really just losing Derrick Henry and it just all falling apart for him. I definitely didn't peg Adam as the team that I would have projected to be our toilet bowl champion, but things just didn't work out well. The matchups towards the end of the season weren't good in his favor. You have teams like John in there that, pretty solid teams, got hot at the right time. It was just a perfect storm of misery for Adam's team towards the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, talking about a 14 regular game schedule season that we had for at least our league, more than halfway through week 8, Adam looked great. And really the remaining 6 weeks, he went from, I believe at week 7, I had him at the top of the rankings, right? In our weekly power rankings. And then who would have ever thought that he would be the toilet bowl king?
Yeah. And I know that didn't work out in your favor too. I know how hard you're for Chought to win that crown for you, but yeah, I mean, it just shows the power of depth. I mean, you have to have it. A guy like Derrick Henry can carry your team, but without him, you got to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that segues nicely into our season 2 recap. So, maybe I'll start off with the reverse order of the season finishing and start off with our Toilet King. Obviously, Adam's season sort of went downhill fast. Were there any other things to note about Adam's season for you last year?
I think the biggest thing is just kind of getting lucky with Aaron Rodgers coming back. I saw that happening over the summer, and that was kind of like, you get panicked, right? Like, even if you don't have him on your team, it's kind of like the trickle down effect of that. And just for Adam's team that already was lacking depth, I thought that was a big get for him, and it could propel him right back to the top of our standings next year. Looking at this team, though, I mean, you did have quite a bit of, I would say, disappointment just in some players that we were hoping would break out or hoping would be more consistent. There are a lot of kind of boom bust players on this roster. Tyler Lockett's the biggest one. And as we go forward looking into next year, I think that's only going to be more polarizing. But, Adam Thielen kind of had an up and down season. Miles Sanders didn't seem to make the leap that everyone was kind of hoping. Adam does have Joe Burrow, who obviously is solidifying himself as a top 5 quarterback for the, distant future. So there's pieces on this team for sure. But I'm not sure that, and I don't know if you have the same opinion, but I'm not sure that those depth issues have been resolved at this point. So I'm not convinced that the same issues might not occur again this season.
Well, I mean, in terms of depth being addressed, he hasn't made any moves. So I think it's sort of staying as is.
I tried to phrase that nicely.
I think what comes to mind for Adam for me is in I think just dynasty overall, you just need to pick a time of when you're looking to contend and what are some of the positions that you want to have when you're entering that contention window with your roster. And I just see a mix of sort of a lot of aging prospects who, maybe a few years ago were considered top producers, but they're on the outskirts. And I think, even our starting roster, we have Alvin Kamara. McLaurin didn't necessarily take the leap that we expected. I don't think he has a much better situation at quarterback with, Wentz being there now. Tyler Lockett without, Russell Wilson, Adam Thielen's, AJ Brown is probably, Antonio Brown is probably not going to be much. Miles Sanders. But overall, he does have awesome dynasty assets, right? And Joe Burrow and Kyle Pitts, and I think you couldn't pick a better sort of 1-2 sort of combination for you to build a roster around. So that's just my overall sort of thoughts on Adam. Where do you have Adam sort of finishing this year? Do you think?
Just to add towards the end of yours too. The good part about Adam not making many moves is he has all of his draft picks too. So looking at a top pick this year might be something that really helps his team. As far as this year, looking forward, kind of my predictions, I do have Adam in here that I currently have. I have him on the outside looking in as far as playoffs. I do think Adam will make a few waves throughout the season. He's always got that. He's got some players on that team that I think could surprise us. But I don't think there's consistency there to really make a run to the playoffs. I have him right on that like 4 to 5 win kind of range. So looking at 4-10 or 5-9, which I don't think is anywhere close to being good enough for the playoffs. The downside is, though, obviously with injuries, I think it could be even worse. So without depth, I think that there could be some challenges here.
Awesome. So you got him at 4-10, 5-9, somewhere like that. And you think that's going to be good enough for a 5th and 6th place finish. So you're assuming the bottom two, maybe we'll hint at it later, is going to be maybe you're there now.
Be, 6th and 7th, I would say, is probably more realistic. If he pushes for the 6th spot by the end of the year, I'd be pretty surprised.
All right. Yeah, I got him roughly about the same place. I think, like I said, I think there's going to be weeks where he's probably the highest league scoring, manager for the week, just because if you have a healthy Derrick Henry, anything happens, right?
Of course.
So I think, all that said, but I think it's going to be just the consistent output of the players all involved. And no players on his roster are in a better situation today than they were last season, for example. They just added additional age. So yeah, I got him roughly, outside looking in as well. All right, maybe let's shift over to one of our first new managers in Kyle. And yeah, let me just load up his screen real quick. But yeah, how do you sort of feel about our new manager sort of coming in?
Yeah, while you load the screen, I just want to give props to both our new managers. I know we've talked about this a lot, you and I, just how happy we are with all the interactions that are going on, all the moves, the new trade offers getting sent out. This is a whole wave of activity that I don't think in our wildest dreams we could have expected or hoped for, but could not be happier. So both Kyle and Sergey, great job right off the bat. We'll jump into kind of the draft, and there's a little bit more to talk about with these two, but been loving everything I've been seeing from both of them.
Yeah, I'm excited, man. And I can't, speaking of Kyle and Sergey, love the additions, and I honestly cannot wait for the near future when we're able to have that caliber of managers really continue to bump the bar of our standards with new managers being added in, and hopefully we get to our full size of a 10 league very soon. So, with the new managers, Brandon, obviously they started off, their official first activity a few weeks back with the new manager draft. So let's start there for Koopa Cup Coffee. How do you feel about Kyle's draft?
Yeah, I think Kyle did a great job of kind of pivoting off of maybe what was his initial strategy. Seeing Sergey coming out guns blazing, getting some of those big names, but burning through, almost all of his money in the process. So Kyle was able to kind of change up maybe what he was thinking he was going to do. Maybe it was his plan all along. But really, he was able to kind of cherry pick whoever he wanted in that draft for very cheap prices towards the end. I mean, virtually free towards the end. So I think that's very reflective in his roster. Well, his roster is very different from when that draft occurred, but at the same time, like lots of depth on that roster. Immediately following the draft, that was a playoff contending roster. So anytime you can do that from two rosters that didn't make the playoffs, that's a job well done, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, Kyle, in my opinion, with the draft played that so well. To your point around the late sort of the picks that were value, I think he got the combination of CMC, Diggs, and Saquon for like $80 combined at the auction. And like each of one of those players are probably worth over 80 by themselves. So that was awesome value to see. And then it's resulted with, especially with his post moves, he obviously came out of that with weak starter quarterbacks. And immediately made that trade with you for Dak. I believe he made some other trades as well, right?
Oh yeah, I mean he got quite a bit from me alone. Eckler he now has in his lineup, so that's going to be a top 5 sort of asset this year. He's made lots of moves. He's got Mike Evans in there, so with Tom Brady back, that should be a consistent sort of solid flex spot. He's definitely going for it. Although he's also gotten, for me again, Michael Pittman. So there's still some youth on this team. Darnell Moody's still on the bench there. It's a good team. There's a lot of top end talent, that might be getting close to their decline, but at the same time, they're going to produce this year, no question. We kind of talked about Adam having an issue with like not improving situations. I think it's pretty much the opposite with Kyle's team. A lot of these players benefited from some improved situations. I don't see any real holes on this team. I think there's enough depth, even given all the trades he's made, to still withstand an injury or two. This is, like I said, definitely a built to win now sort of squad. Anything other than that, I think really is going to throw off the plan. So, if he comes out of the gate and has some losses, it'll be interesting to see how he responds to that. But this is, one of those teams that I definitely have my eye on to win it all this season.
Yeah, I mean, maybe touching that a little bit. I definitely have Kyle as a lock-in for playoffs this season. Obviously, we're gonna have just 4 positions again, given that we're 18 league. Where do you sort of have him within, the 4 of the playoff seeds?
There's been a lot of moves. There's a lot of teams, I think, that see themselves as playoff teams or legit contenders. But to me, Kyle's team is still at the top. I think it's tightening. Since we looked at this last week and I had a different idea and kind of different tiers, but for me, this is the team to beat at this point in our league.
Yeah, I think I agree for sure. He's, like you said, he's deep. He's high end deep at running backs and receivers. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better CMC Eckler being your receiver, RB1, RB2. And if you have Saquon Barkley coming off as a flex, that's amazing. Saquon Diggs, Cooper Kupp starting, and you've got Mike Evans and DeAndre Hopkins as your flex. That's great. And we haven't even mentioned, like Melvin Gordon, for as much hate as he gets from especially Javonte Williams owners, like he's going to be a solid RB2, right? He's going to be a 1B somewhere once he gets signed. Plus he's got the likes of, Allen Robinson, who I think is due for a rebound. Obviously, a player like that doesn't just disappear and he's on the regression end, right? He just was upset about the contract situation last year and playing for Matt Nagy and Matt Pace. But I think he's got Michael Gallup, who's in a much better situation. Michael Pittman, he's not even making his flex spot right now, right? Darnell Mooney should be stepping up. So yeah, I think I agree, man. I got Kyle at the sort of the top end tier for sure of our league, shoo-in for playoffs. And he's going to be the contender for us in this league going.
Yeah. And to put kind of a pin in that, like look at Tua too. If Tua comes out, he's got every tool that anyone could ever hope for at this point in that offense. If he, takes that next step and becomes a solid quarterback, I don't know how you beat this squad. I mean, week in and week out, this is going to be your consistent high scorer across the board. All
right, let's move over to Sergey, our other new manager of the year. And I'm pulling up his roster now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start with the kickoff draft, the startup draft for Sergey. I mean, like I said before, he came out guns blazing. You could tell Sergey had his targets, and he was going to make sure he left with them. And I can't argue with that strategy. I mean, it's Dynasty. You're going to be stuck with these players for years potentially, unless they're on my team. But anyways, he came out, he was willing to pay for him. He went and got him. I mean, you got Justin Jefferson, clearly the best player available in this draft, which is going to set you up nicely, for 10 years potentially as your wide receiver one. So can't argue with the strategy, but it's basically the opposite end as far as team comparisons. There's no depth on this team right now. That's the big issue. There's also some lacking quarterback play. And there's a lot of potential wild cards, a lot of things that, a lot of boom or bust sort of players.
Yeah, man, I don't have much to add to that. I think, he definitely, what I'll say this is if his goal was to go into the Dynasty, the expansion draft with players that he wanted to bring as Dynasty blue chip assets, he certainly got it, in being able to secure Justin Jefferson, DK Metcalf, George Kittle. I think he overvalues a little bit on Elijah Moore and Michael Carter. I know you have some opinions about the Jets offense overall, so maybe you can touch on some of those points. I think that'll be interesting to talk about too.
I mean, I'm a Jets hater, and that's not hard to do. But really, when you're trying to think back to like the last legitimately consistent fantasy asset for the Jets, it's really hard to do. I like Zach Wilson. I think he is the quarterback of the future there, but they have so many missing pieces, and I don't think they're happy with any of their skill positions. I wouldn't be surprised to see them come away with a wide receiver or two and a running back out of this draft. So, that happens. They get one of those top tier wide receivers. It's obviously going to push Elijah Moore down. As far as running back, Michael Carter's a good running back, but I don't think he's a bell cow in that offense. And then they have O-line issues, all sorts of issues across the board. So, I mean, there's a lot of pieces there. They don't have the proven track record of being able to develop them. So we'll see. But yeah, I mean, Sergey clearly valued those guys, and it's hard to argue with that. Just a matter of situation at this point.
Yeah, I think, if the draft for the expansion draft happened after the NFL draft and the Jets didn't add a new receiver, Jets did not add a new running back. I've seen, players like the Drake Londons, Chris Olave's, the Garrett Wilson sort of projected to go for that first round Jets pick. And even I've seen this thing like Kenneth Walker being projected in that second round pick for the Jets as well. So I have his team sort of in this, who knows, after sort of we see the NFL draft happening, because I think that's going to make a big impact because Sergey paid up for Elijah Moore. Sergey paid up for Michael Carter. And also Sergey paid up for J.K. Dobbins, which is also a flex play there as well.
Yeah, I mean, the concerns I have with this team right now are that I'm looking at it from a best case scenario. And I still view it as kind of a middle of the road, not quite playoff worthy, given that best case scenario. The problem is there's a lot of potential for worst case scenario just coming out of the NFL draft. And that scares me a little bit, especially on a team that's already lacking depth.
How do you think about Sergey's sort of timing of contention? He's obviously traded all of his first picks away. He's got players like Joe Mixon and James Conner, who are his RB1, RB2, but he's got a lot of other youth, right? Just maybe talk through like the contention, because for me personally, don't understand what his window looks like. And like I said, I have him the same sort of tier, this middling, maybe challenge for a playoff seed, but not really a contender, maybe more likely to miss depending because of his depth. How do you sort of think about that timing aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have that, but you obviously want a blend of youth and veterans for sure. That's always the good thing in Dynasty. You always want that influx in youth. The problem is if you're not already over the hump into the playoffs where anything can happen, you're kind of that middling team that's just going to see those veterans lose their value, not be able to trade, anything positive for them to improve your team. And that's like the worst place to be. We'll get to my recap a little bit, but I kind of saw that vision on the wall, or the writing on the wall with my team last year, where I wasn't quite going to be over the hump in the playoffs given these new teams and, where everyone stood. So I took the idea of selling everything off. Sergey, I think, I think he's going for it. I think he's going for it by, selling his first round picks. He's going for it. I don't know if it's, maybe he's seeing something we're all not seeing. Just as far as value of these guys. there is potential here. There are some big names on this roster for sure. But to call this a no doubter playoff team, I have a hard time doing that. And really, it's not even close as far as a no doubter contender at this point.
Where do you have him overall sort of sitting at the end of the season?
I'm probably a little bit more bullish on him than the consensus. I think he'll be right around the 5th, 6th spot with upside to squeak in. Anything can happen in fantasy. I think he could be one of those teams that squeaks into the 4th spot. But my range of outcomes for this team is incredibly large. I also think he could be, sitting at 7th, right in front of me. Like, I think that is possible just given what happens in the NFL draft and then one injury. He's one injury. He's a Joe Mixon injury away from, not being able to win many games.
Yeah, I feel the same. I think all goes right. I think if all goes right, Sergey can potentially find himself 3/4 of the way down, like 10 games into the season, feeling comfortable about his playoff seeding, right? Mm-hmm. Because James Conner's in a better situation. Joe Mixon continues to play as a top 5 running back in that offense. Jalen Hurts, as bad of a real NFL quarterback he is, remains a fantasy elite quarterback option. Trevor Lawrence steps up. George Kittle gets more target share, especially if, Deebo Samuels ends up sort of finding himself out of San Francisco. So I think all those, and then the Jets don't pick up any of the skill players that push down Michael Carter's and Elijah Moore's down, but that's a lot of ifs, right? Yeah. But I'll say this, I have him setting sort of at that 6th spot as well. And I do have the likes of, this is a team that I'll put in here. I'm not going to be surprised if he makes the playoffs, if everything went well. So that's sort of the tier that I have for Sergey there.
Yeah.
All right, let's move over to sort of, John. And I think I sort of want to sort of label him as maybe the sweetheart of the draft last week or last year. Felt, unexpected how the thing sort of turned out. But yeah, let's start with John. How'd you sort of think about, what were some of the memorable sort of storylines for you last year with John?
I mean, John had some of the worst luck, I think, right out of the gate that you could ever imagine. Lost Irv Smith, which I know he had high hopes for. Guy's still young. I think he's still going to be a stud in this league. But he had a lot of injuries right out of the gate. And then he had some trades based on that, I think, that hurt him in the long run last season. I know John kind of beats himself up over that Jonathan Taylor trade that he made, which was a huge trade at the time. And still is probably one of the biggest we've seen. Obviously, in hindsight, you wouldn't probably trade Jonathan Taylor for all of that alone. But at the same time, given the scenario, and you were involved in that trade, so I'll let you speak on that a little bit more. But John has talent on this team. It didn't go away last year. He's got Justin Herbert at the top, who obviously broke out last year, is looking like a stud. He's going to be around forever. Nick Chubb, consistent. Deebo Samuel, that's going to, at this point, that's kind of the catalyst for this team. What happens there? If his whole thing is about not wanting to be running back and doing that sort of role, that's going to diminish his value. I mean, that's what made Deebo Samuel a stud. And not to say he's not a good wide receiver, but the hybrid role is what gave him that fantasy value, what made him that kind of unicorn. So if that goes away, and I mean, I get it for his longevity, maybe for fantasy purposes that helps too, but yeah, I mean, that could hurt his lineup and his chances.
Yeah, man, I think so talking about sort of the memorable moments for John, obviously the big trade, Jonathan Taylor, I think week 4, obviously I was the receiving end of Jonathan Taylor in that trade. Talking with John, there's a few things, the storylines that were developing the first 3 weeks of that season that allowed for that trade to happen, which is Jonathan Taylor started off with a very, very cold streak. First 3 weeks, he was basically, I think, number 26, number 26, number 24 running back, something like that. I don't believe he had a single touchdown through the first 3 weeks. In fact, he had a lot of goal line carries that he just didn't convert. And that was also unsure with Nyheim Hines, I think, was expected to take the third down backs all the time.
Marlon Mack.
And you had Marlon Mack. Exactly. Yeah. You had Marlon Mack sort of, in the fray, right, of sort of coming in here anytime. And that was his first round pick, John, right? 105 in the starter dynasty draft was picked up. And this is also when sort of the Niners backfield with the hype around Trey Sermon, because he started in that week 4 and he was on fire that week, where Elijah Moore sort of was hot week 2, week 3. He already picked up Elijah Moore off the waiver for free. And then just attaching sort of Trey Sermon, I think John felt like that was a good way for him to secure the services of the Niners backfield, however it broke down. And then obviously Jeff Wilson sort of ended up sort of taking in the latter end of the season. But the thing that I want to sort of compliment about John, because I think, I feel like John played it really wise, right? Meaning John knew when he felt like he needed to build for the future and this season is not it, he made all the appropriate moves for that, right? Because the JT trade, sure, was still building for the future, right? Getting sort of the additional picks. I believe he got 3 first-round picks out of that. And then picking up sort of Elijah Mitchell, Trey Sermon. And then later in the season, right, we saw him trading away aging players like Zeke. Right? Also, I was on the receiving end of that. And he was able to pick up Amon-Ra St. Brown, who ended up really, shining through in the closing weeks of the season. And I look at his roster now, we haven't even mentioned Trey Lance. And I think that's a great, obviously a breakout target, likely, hopefully for this year. John, given being a big 49ers fan, I think really wants to see that happen. Devontae Smith, on there. Looking at Cam Akers should be due for an actual healthy rebound. I don't really discount where he was last year coming back. I think he just came back early. And, he traded Calvin Ridley away and he picked up Chris Godwin. And a week after, right, we got to remember John's curse, which is if you trade for a player, they're going to go into IR the week after. Started off with you getting
DJ Chark. It happened.
DJ Chark
broke his ankle 2 days later. Yeah.
I think he was like 2 minutes into that game and he broke his ankle. And then Chris Godwin, and when he got Chris Godwin, I got Calvin Ridley. I mean, he decided to just mentally retire from the game of football like that week, right? Yeah. But I look at it, overall, I think he's got a lot of players on his roster. Some of the players like Juju Smith-Schuster, Christian Kirk, Irv Smith, who should be back and given a chance to sort of rebound. But a lot of his players, man, he didn't get any production from last year. And I mean, also including Michael Thomas, by the way, who he got as part of the Calvin Ridley trade, which is basically a throw-in. Right. He got no production from any of those players. And that's a lot of depth, right? So I think he's got a good depth. All that said, and he's got all his picks, right? So how do you sort of see John's position for the season, where his standing is in Dynasty format?
I think John's in wait and see mode for this season. I think I agree with everything you said, and I think John was smart not to just blow it up last year because of injuries. I think that would have really set him back. So I think this year, he's basically returning the core of his original team with some very smart additions. So again, I don't discount anything that happened last season. For me, just as far as like the talent that's been accruing at the top and kind of the arms race that seems to have been going on up there, I don't put John quite in that like true contender for a championship, but he's right in the mix for a playoff spot. I currently have John battling it out for the 4th and final spot. And I think kind of a worst case scenario for John this year, I don't see him falling any further than like 6th overall in our league.
Yeah, I got him sitting at the same spot. I think he's going to be battling between that 5 and 4 range. But I do think the interesting storyline for John and full Chubb is he's due for a lot of moves in midseason, I think, right? A lot has to do with like he's in probably wait and see mode.
Yeah. And I think that's key. And, if his team comes out and loses a few games, and you can tell pretty quick whether or not you're going to contend just based on how everyone else is scoring. John has a lot of assets on this team that a playoff team would die for. So hopefully some of us haven't stolen too many of those first round picks and young wide receivers, but there's definitely ways to build your team, but he's also got, young guys that he could use as trade bait to get a stud. So I think John's probably just in wait and see mode, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him pull the trigger on one direction or the other fairly quickly. earlier than the trade deadline. I don't think this is a team you could wait till the trade deadline on this team. It's probably going to be, just barely missing the playoffs, which I don't think that's where he wants to be. So one way or the other, I think John will make some moves.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, whatever move he decides to make or whatever direction he decides to take, he's got pieces to make anything happen, I think, depending on where he finds himself midseason. All right, man. So that's on John. And then now we're going to move over to last year's fourth place. So the first of the playoff seeds, which was me. So let me pull up my roster real quick, Brandon.
Yeah, just while you're doing that, I mean, I'll run my little perspective on your season. Anyone that watched any of my preview videos or anything last year, I knew that one of my favorite things to do was to kind of clown on your team. And that stopped being a thing at week 9. I stopped being able to, say that your team was shitty. Because I mean, it turned around quickly. Jonathan Taylor, big catalyst. DeAndre Swift, huge catalyst there. I mean, you just broke out with some of these massive trades, like 10-player moves that completely change, the outlook of your team and really put you in a win now mode. So yeah, I mean, what do you want to add about your previous season and going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing there was everything that set in motion for me was the Jonathan Taylor trade in week 4, right? Obviously, I traded away. Well, I'll put it this way. I headed into the season right after the starter draft, and I just sort of felt like I was middle of the road, not enough high-end talent, not enough depth. And the last thing I wanted to do was for me to be a middling position. So I just felt like in the inaugural season when the hype is there, I just felt like strategically it's in my best interest for me to be the first one to lay down the cards and just build for the future years. And that was the initial trade I made preseason with Yves, with Chouba, trading away Lamar Jackson and getting the likes of Justin Fields and Zach Wilson, and then the 2 firsts and the 2 seconds, just as an asset accrual game.
Rebuild.
So yeah, exactly, right. Just the fact that I never had something to build in the first place, it was just building my team for the future, right? So I just felt like that was the mode and the mentality that I had, because at that point I had DeAndre Swift. I also got CeeDee Lamb out of it, who I just didn't think it was going to be a contender type of a run receiver, but it felt good about the dynasty outlook. And ultimately, that was the mode heading into it. I made some other moves, picking up picks. But really, I think the catalyst for me and my storyline last year was week 4 trade with John on Jonathan Taylor, because I did not expect Jonathan Taylor to be breaking out immediately after that and establishing himself as a firmly RB1, especially post week 8's Derrick Henry's injury. And now I've sort of found myself heading into this offseason where it's like, oh shit, I were built for this 3 to 4 year type of a window. And I thought I'd be building basically for the year after the 2023 season. But here I find myself sort of tied down to what I think is my contention window now. If it's possible, I need to build around Jonathan Taylor. And then that sort of led to all these off-season moves. I was a little upset I got to start slower on the offseason just because I was out of the continent. But all these moves that you've seen since then, I think it's really just using the assets that I've accrued without not mortgaging my future, because I still have more than the average picks for the future, but just felt the pressure that I need to build around it.
Let's because I mean, we didn't, like, full disclosure for this video, I don't know if we wanted to mention this or not, but we had some audio issues the first time through, which actually worked out to be the day that Tim and I made the Josh Allen trade. Sure. So we recorded this video prior to the Josh Allen trade. Now we can get some breakdown of that, because I mean, that to me, there's been a lot of like big shift kind of blockbusters. We've had a lot of those already this season. To me, getting Josh Allen, and of course I might be a little bit of a homer, but that's a paradigm shifting kind of move, especially to add him to a team like yours that may or may not have even needed him. Walk me through that. You already talked about how your timeline is tied to your running backs, which really pushes everything up. Any other analysis you want to offer up just based what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things, which is I felt like I was in this sort of, I need to maximize my chances over the next 5 years, right? And it's no different than I'm assuming what any sports GM looks like when they have a superstar on their roster they need to build around. You have to maximize that, right? You cannot piss away the years. You cannot be the 76ers and pissing away the Joel Embiid years. You cannot be the Warriors and then not build around Steph Curry, right? So yeah, I just feel like you just need to build around it. And that was Jonathan Taylor for me, right? And I see obviously the DeAndre Swift, I see the Javonte Williams all stepping up. And then I sort of looked around the league and I realized that with you actually forced my hand, which is you went into this full rebuild mode. And if you didn't, I don't think I make this Josh Allen move because I'm still having the most amount of assets. So I just felt a little bit more comfortable sitting in that position. But with you basically accruing two-thirds of the league's first rounder picks, I'm sort of sitting here and thinking, all right, I think Brandon's going to be very scary come 2025, 2026, especially with all these picks that are happening. And I think at that point, with the picks that we have and seeing the aging sort of rosters, I just felt like there was going to be a top tier in terms of dynasty asset this 3-4 years out. And I just wanted to do something because I felt like my roster wasn't separating. Like I'm not a true contender. I think before the Josh Allen, I felt good about my chances making the playoffs, but I didn't feel comfortable with my chances of being the tier of this contender thing. So really the way that I looked at it is, hey, I know Brandon's in this asset accrual game. And, you know, with the confidence that Brandon probably has with the film that he watches on players, you're probably going to be able to feel comfortable. You're going to pick a lot, the index of the superstars in terms of fantasy outputs for the next few years. Maybe Josh Allen's available, who I, by the way, have as the QB1 in Dynasty, just internally for me. I think it's just him or Mahomes, but I'd take, Josh Allen over that. And also I can't trade for Mahomes with Yves because he's in contender window, right? So I just felt like Josh Allen just sort of fit for me. For me to feel comfortable that my quarterback spot didn't have to rely on the luck of Justin Fields and Zach Wilson breaking out this year. I think they're great assets for the future. I have no intention of trading them. I actually look at Zach Wilson and Justin Fields as basically my first round equivalents for the future. Right. So if they break out or if they don't, if they're continuing to improve, that's going to be good for me to flip. But I don't need to flip because I have Josh Allen and Kyler Murray sort of, being my starters. So I just feel like overall my roster and Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, Jonathan Taylor, DeAndre Swift, CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown, Javonte Williams, Travis Etienne, now Deontay Johnson. I still have depth, right? Quarterback, I have Zach Wilson, Justin Fields. I have Zeke now, not even on my flex. I think anyone would be happy to have him as a flex, especially for at least this season up ahead. I was able to get Cortland Sutton, which I think is a great sort of, depth option. I should have Rondell Moore sort of being able to sort of produce a little bit more than he did last year. The only question mark for me, I think, is the tight end spot. But I just took a bunch of dart throws. Let's see how the David Njoku sort of pan out, the Mike Gesicki sort of pan out, the Cole Kmets and the Pat Freiermuths. Because Gronk is probably good for one more season, if that, right? So that's generally how I look at it. I feel like I put myself in this contender tier without needing to mortgage my future because I still have my first round picks that I've had. Plus, I still have the assets that I can trade that don't need to go on my starters, like the two quarterbacks that I mentioned earlier. So I just felt like that was just the move that I needed to make, which is maximize my time before you come into contention, 3 to 4 years out.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting too. Just it's funny how much it feels like our two teams have kind of played off each other. I saw you rise to prominence so quickly last year, and I mentioned it week after week, like how scary your team is going to be. I thought it would be in 2 years, 3 years. It's now, but how scary it was going to be. Like you had a juggernaut. You have all these young guys, all this treasure trove of draft picks. Like your team is kind of the dream dynasty team. So yeah, I mean, looking at mine, and I've already mentioned that I felt I was kind of middling, and Josh Allen's by far my favorite player, but at the same time, you can't fall in love with guys too much. It's a tough move. I think it's kind of a league shifting move. I will say our prior video, I had you, I think, sitting kind of at like 3. Yeah. It's still obvious. I had our championship tier at 3 teams. I now have it at 2. I have you and right at the top. I give the edge a little bit to Kyle. I don't really know why. But your team definitely has the highest ceiling this season than any by far. So I think if you start to get consistent production across the board, there's no beating you. So yeah, my championship tier at this point is 2 with you included.
Yeah, I think, that was the goal for the trade for Josh Allen in the first place. So I think at least what I consider a needle making move for my roster in just jumping that tier. I also don't have myself as a favorite for the league. I do like my depth. I don't think my team is at its ceiling. Meaning I think I get stronger even with this existing roster. I should get stronger year over year for the next 3 years. So I think, I think this is a year that I hope to be able to at least make into the finals in the top 2. And we'll see what we need to sort of do and jigger around midseason or end of the season, next off season, because I should have enough sort of picks and assets for me to make moves or even accrue more picks for whatever it is. But yeah, I think that's how I look at my season and sort of the roster heading into season 2 for me.
Yeah, what's nice about yours too is that you don't have many fall off players here. I mean, there's Zeke, but other than outside of Zeke, I mean, you have a lot of guys that are going to hold value for trades and moves and tinkering and getting to kind of play with your roster.
Yeah. So, all right, let's move over to Brandon, your roster. I got your roster loaded up now. You finished third last year. I'm not even going to start. I think you're just going to be at the bottom of the league, but that's by design. Man, you're going to have, I'm scrolling down to your picks. And holy shit, it doesn't even fit on one screen. It does not fit on my screen right now.
Obviously, I mean, my strategy is very clear. I said it before. I traded for Austin Eckler last year with you. I gave up Javonte. It was a big move. Like a week later, I started to regret it because Javonte started to like really show what he was going to be. But at the time, I mean, you have to either go for it or you have to start rebuilding. I got that move. For a few weeks, it kind of felt like maybe that would put me over the top. I was always in that playoff tier, but again, never really in that championship tier. I think I was only at the top of the power rankings 1 week, and that was pretty much built off hype because I had made a couple moves. But my team was a roller coaster, man. I mean, I would go from the lowest scoring team 2 weeks in a row to the highest, and then a guy gets hurt and I'm out and I have no depth, and it was just a disaster. It was probably the most frustrating season I've ever had in fantasy. So, when our new managers joined and I saw Kyle build his squad that I definitely thought could win now. Sergey built a good squad. I made that trade with Kyle right off the bat and got rid of Dak. To me, at that point, I still was like, well, I could maybe accrue some assets and get right back to where I was. Once I traded Mixon, once I traded Eckler, obviously it's a completely different story. And I'm not going to be the guy. I'm not going to be happy with middle of the road. Obviously, hopefully in like a year or two, I'm in the middle of the road with a treasure trove of assets still to come. But, I'm all in on this kind of totally tear it down, rebuild it up. So yeah, I mean, the picks are huge. Like you said, indexing, that's the perfect way to describe it. No one's perfect at, drafting rookies, that's for sure. But at the same time, if you can get 60% of them, the odds of you hitting on, 1 or 2, maybe 3 are very high. So that's really, I think, what my strategy is going forward. I've also been lucky. I mean, I've gotten a few wide receivers just kind of as not throw-ins, but tag-ons to some of these moves I've made that I think are already kind of like first-round pick assets. Rashad Bateman, I'm very high on. You just got to stay healthy. Today I got Kadarius Toney. That's just another one. Who knows? His situation's weird, of course, but another kind of dart throw. Gabe Davis, that was kind of a throw in that, again, upside or could be a big downside if they draft another wide receiver. So you never know, but at the same time, they feel like more established assets in kind of halfway decent scenarios for the most part that I might be able to build on. A big learning lesson for me, sorry, I'm kind of rambling, but a big learning lesson for me is looking at your team, and not to say, you should have done anything different, but if you hitch your ride to a young running back too soon, your window of opportunity is very small. And I have acquired a few running backs, although at this point I don't foresee them being part of my core when I'm truly contending. But my goal is to just, keep accruing those young wide receivers, hopefully getting a few young quarterbacks so that my window stays wide and follows the timeline of those wide receivers rather than running backs.
I mean, I think about just Dynasty as whether you're in contention now or win now or not, you always want to be able to be in rebuilding as well as your contention window to be with assets that are accruing over time.
Yeah.
And then maybe you have 1 or 2 depreciation assets that are going to be able to contribute for that short timeline that you do have. Or you have assets that are stable that hold their value, like draft picks. Right. And again, I'm looking at your draft picks. You got 13 on Sleeper. Obviously, that's not including Choda's pick for next year. So you have 14 first rounds. out of 24 possible first round picks for the next 3 seasons. Like that's an exception of maybe we get to 10 teams or whatever, but whether it's 24 or 28 max, you have 14 of the first round picks. Man, dude, if you think about how scary your roster may look come 2025 after you depleted through the selection of those picks, you're looking at, I think in any given year, there's probably 3 players that get picked in a draft, first or second rounds, who end up becoming wide receiver 1s, QB 1s, RB 1s, tight end 1s, or whatever. And even if you just do a very conservative approach of having 50% of your hit rate, out of your 14 first rounds, and you got another 2, 3, 4, 5 plus the Chota pick. So you got 6 second rounders. So out of your 21st and second over the next, 3 years, you're probably going to have 10, which I believe is the starting roster, by the way, of our count. You're going to have 10, I think, RB1s, receiver 1s, QB1 type of players that are going to accrue over time. So man, this is scary in terms of where you're at. But I think overall, I think I mentioned this on Sleeper today, right? Like it's the great experiment in capitalization letters, right? It's like you are building the Dynasty format you're building your team in a format that only exists in Dynasty. And I think you're going about in a very all-in approach. And the result of it is, man, you are stacked at the draft picks. And I think we'll see the fruits of your labor and your bet and your experiment in the next 2 to 3 years. And I would not be surprised if you are a one top sort of contender come 2025, 2026, maybe even earlier, right? Maybe there is especially the 2023 drafts, or maybe there's players that, surprise us in 2022. And I think that's going to be sort of where once that wagon you hitch to, maybe that running back talent that you're talking about, that probably starts to open up your window, in those latter years.
Yeah, I think, just forecasting future drafts too. I think everyone knows that 2022 is kind of a down year for drafts, although it has good depth in wide receivers. So that kind of worked out perfectly for me. And then next year is just, there's the potential for quite a few solid prospects coming out of that across the board.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know my wagon at that point to, some of those running backs probably. But at the same time, it kind of worked out for me as far as my timeline and the future draft classes.
Man, my only hope, and we're going to segue over to Yves now, but my only hope for 2023, especially with how top loaded that talent class coming for 2023 looks like, you have 4 first rounders next year, including Chota. Actually, you got 5, including Chota next year. So same count as you do this year. And with your pick, with Kennedy, Kyle, Ryan, and Sergey's picks, plus Chota, you at least have 2, obviously.
Yeah.
And 2 high ones, because Chota's going to be 103 odds. Maybe you get, one of those to miss the playoffs, and you get 3 chances out of 4. And man, imagine if you're able to secure the top 3 of the Jackson Igbas, the Bryce Youngs, the Bijan Robinsons that are coming out next year. Dude, your roster is going to be pretty scary. My only goal and hope is that somehow, some way, Yves misses the playoffs this year, and then that's my lottery contention for next. So let's move over to Yves then.
Yeah, that's a good segue. I think his team was start to finish one that we always had as a contender, one that we always thought would be there in the end. Yves made moves throughout the season, some big ones for sure. I mean, he got Lamar Jackson. Patrick Mahomes last year was kind of all over the place. So even given that, though, this team was still chugging right along. Najee Harris, obviously, perfect spot for Pittsburgh. David Montgomery. Everything is there. Everything is there to succeed. Some weeks it seems like he's the guy, but that's kind of I would say still a red flag. In my opinion, but this is a good team. Travis Kelce probably getting more targets this year, so an even higher ceiling for him. I will say, Yves didn't seem to hit the injury bug as far as I can remember too much last year, which is good for him because if there's one glaring weakness on this team, it would be depth. But Yves did really good last year, and I think the biggest story for him last year was Cordell Patterson. Getting him off waivers pretty early, and the revelation that he was last year really carried this team.
That's $6 spent on Fab.
Yeah, seriously.
I think, yeah, you're right about the storylines. I think Yves and Ryan, I think, were the two managers that we always had as the playoff shoo-ins. And then they both like stayed consistent all throughout, right? And it made no shock to anyone that they were the top two finishing last year. I think I'll start with the positives in terms of the outlook on season 2, because I think you touched on all the sort of the memorable storylines for Yves last season. But heading to season 2, I'll start with the positives, which is I think players like Chase Edmonds, players like Brandon Ayuk, and even Dawson Knox's. I think they're all in and Cedric Wilson. I think they're all in better situations than they were last season. I look at Chase Edmonds as like a rich man, Myles Gaskin. I think he's going to be able to get a lot more production there, especially not having to split time with James Conner. So overall, I think there's a lot of decent things. Cordell Patterson, he's going to still continue to produce this year. So I think that's generally how I sort of think about it. And it's a deep roster. You got Hunter Renfrow, Josh Jacobs, and Lenny, sitting as your flex. Like you could not wish for a stronger flex in terms of sort of the talent there at those positions. But I look at sort of everything else, and I feel a couple things, which is I feel like the top end talent for him has suppressed a little bit. Maybe Mahomes goes back to his thing, but he's Tyreek less now. Yeah. Lamar Jackson is always going to be a top 5 QB fantasy wise, but he had a down season. So, is he always going to be a top 5, or is he going to be a top 10 like he was last season? Najee, who knows? I don't think he's going to be in a worse situation per se, but I look at players like David Montgomery. I don't see him, being a top end talent. I think he's a solid RB2 flex type of play, which he has him at. But then I look at like Devontae Adams, obviously getting balls thrown to him from Derek Carr now instead of Aaron Rodgers. I think that's going to probably take the ceiling away quite a bit. So that's sort of how I see it. And then pair that with the rise in other teams, right? He only had to compete with Ryan last year, but now he's having to compete with Kyle and me, where the roster for him has sort of strength relative wise has maybe come down, where the other teams have sort of gone up. So how do you sort of see his season outlook, Brandon?
I currently have him. He's my four seed. He's the one I think everyone's kind of got to knock off, looking at the Johns, looking at the Sergeys, that sort of tier, which is hard to do. The problem I'm seeing is more from like the dynasty standpoint on this team. Obviously traded away pretty much all of his draft picks going forward. And I think this team is needing a solid running back or a solid wide receiver to really be able to burst through to like third, second sort of seed. And the problem is I'm not sure that there's the assets here to do that, to acquire that sort of player without, weakening your starting lineup. So I think that could be an issue going forward. I'm not sure that, it'll impact him too much this year. But the path to the championship is pretty tough, like you alluded to. And, as we know, injuries are a huge piece of fantasy football. And one of these main guys, Najee got a lot of run last year, which he seemed to handle fine, but at the same time, even Derrick Henry breaks down. So it makes me nervous for sure. If he misses any time, I don't know how this team's going to be able to recover from that. So right now I have him pretty solidly on the 4 line. Last year, your and I's team got in at 500 record on the. I don't think that's the case this year, although we do have a whole lot of talent. So, you guys at the top might be knocking each other off every week, splitting some matchups. But because, really, other than my team, there's a lot of parity in this league. So I think he's going to have to do better than, 7-7 to get in. I think this is probably an 8-win team as it stands right now.
Yeah, I have a similar perspective on the tiering. I think there is the 3 teams at the contender. Again, I'll include myself, Ryan, and Kyle. I think any one of us could be the highest scoring, team in any given week. But I have that second tier of players and like the Johns, the Yves, and actually maybe Sergey, somewhere there. And I just feel like that tier is where you start to sort of see, or maybe even Adam, right, with everything goes right. So like that tier, I have Yves at the top of that second tier. Or maybe you can even break that second tier into two other tiers, but he'd still be at the top of that second tier, which is likely to sneak into the fourth. I actually have a different perspective, and we'll know mid-season. I'll run the numbers and stuff like that in the last season. But I actually think the fourth seed, I think the top three seeds are going to be 10 win plus.
Yeah,
I do have the fourth team as probably a 6-8 type of a record that allows you to sort of sneak in, because it's going to be so top heavy. We only had two teams that were top heavy last year, and we had a lot of parity. But I think it changes a lot of it this season, especially, so I think all those things sort of happen, and 6-8 maybe is enough to get in. And that's exactly where I have Yves, 6-8, 7-7 type of finish for the season. I do think he's a playoff favorite, at least out of that second tier. But man, I would love for the Canadian number one on our league to be knocked off from the playoffs, and just get equal representation of the Canadians and Americans that are in our league representing the playoffs with just one. But yeah, I mean that'd be a dream for me, and have the lottery balls for Yves in the lottery next year.
I'm pulling for Yves this season. I hope he falls off a cliff next year. I think that's the way it's gonna go.
Yeah. All right, man. Let's move over to our champ. Honestly, it was so well deserved win by Kai for Ryan last year. He just was at the top. I mean, he was going back and forth from a dynasty, like how I had the power ranking, just because we had earlier weeks we had it. But to be honest, man, Ryan was the most consistent team in my opinion last year, from top to from start to finish.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it really spoke to his depth. There was never a week, or there was never a period of time where we were doubting whether or not, he was a solid contender in this league. He really rode those coattails of Tom Brady. And, that's going to most likely continue over into this year. Most underrated, although maybe it's not even underrated, but one of the biggest acquisitions of the year was getting Alexander Mattison. Having Dalvin Cook, knowing Dalvin Cook has that injury history, it just seemed to work out perfect. Well, it worked out where, Cook went down, Ryan had Mattison to come right in and just continue right along his road to the playoffs. So, solid team, obviously with Jamar Chase. This team is when you look at wanting that perfect blend of youth and veterans, this is it. It seems like he's got backups at every position that could come in next year down the road and take over for some of these guys that are getting old or that are injury prone. This team is scary. And then, I was looking at it, he's got Deshaun Watson sitting on his bench. This is another top 5. This is a top 10 overall fantasy potentially. Just chilling on his bench, and it's already a position of strength for him. So it's wild. And you can just tell Ryan knows what he's doing. All of his moves are very calculated. It's easy to, make deals with him because he knows what his timeline is. He knows what he's trying to do to build his team. This is a rock solid team that should be one of those contenders forever sorts of teams.
Yeah, I want to applaud Ryan's depth. And it's not just replacement depth, right? It's actual legit depth that you can just plug in and you're not wincing at it because you're having to start some random player that's like a wide receiver 4 on your flex. He's going to be in any given week with the bye weeks, he's going to be starting Deshaun Watson. He's going to be starting Aaron Jones at flex. He's, if injuries go down, Alexander Madison's there, who we saw last year, to your point, he can put up Dalvin Cook's numbers. He's got Trey Sermon, who I would put as a potential, who knows if there's a bounce back. He's obviously talented. And then we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's going to produce, and Ramondre Stevenson. I think he had a great rookie season last year, right, in terms of what they're able to sort of produce. So, and Marquise Brown's, man, I'm not even finished. Jalen Waddle, Evan Engram, man, he's got so much just depth. And I think that's honestly his strength. And it's all the pieces on the depth are young. I think the only thing that I will say is perhaps I think Ryan is a savvy manager, right? And obviously it showed with him winning and all the trades that he's made. I do think he got very lucky in the offseason that continued to retain his top position as a contender, which is Russell Wilson finds himself in a really great position in Denver now. Tom Brady returning, because if Russell Wilson maybe stayed in Seattle, had the year that he did last year, Tom Brady retires. Now you're sort of looking at a quarterback, 3 top quarterback that was top of the league by a margin, by a large margin, down to maybe a middle of the road sort of a type of or like a playoff play like strength versus contender tier strength at the quarterback spots. I'd be curious to sort of see how Antonio Gibson, like, I mean, maybe we already know that he's going to be a contender this year. Are there any players that you want to sort of highlight on his roster, Brandon?
I mean, looking forward, like looking at the dynasty component of this roster, it's very interesting. Like he's obviously, one of our top contenders this year, but going forward, I mean, this roster is still built to like grow. He's very clearly built around Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle at wide receiver. That's going to be 10 years worth of production there. Now getting T Higgins, there's a lot of, ways that you can build this out. He's lost now his first round picks, although, we know those are going to be end of the round sort of picks. But he still has seconds. He still has some guys that I think, he can retool on the fly, and stay in that contender sort of role. But there's just consistent players here too, like Keenan Allen, like, the guy just gets points. You have your top end sort of, Dalvin Cooks that can go off, and obviously Tyreek Hill, like that'll be an interesting component of this team for sure. Just seeing, how he does with Tua. But Mark Andrews, like at his tight end spot, everything about this team is strong. On my metrics, I have him as, right in that top tier this year. And he's number 2 with dynasty assets right now too. So like, it's just a solid team. He's strong where I think a lot of other teams are weak. Like you mentioned with the depth, tight end is strong. Like where do you find a weakness here? Maybe quarterback. Like you've got 2 old guys that aren't injury prone. So I wouldn't even, put that on them. But if Deshaun Watson doesn't play, but still, I mean, Carson Wentz sitting on his bench. Carson Wentz is obviously not a good quarterback, but you can plug him in out there and he'll get you some points in a week. So like, it's a solid team. I can't find a weakness on this team.
And I think the word that comes up in my head to just describe Ryan's team is, I mean, it's fitting that his team's name is Brady Star Dynasty, right? The word dynasty comes to mind, right? It's the beginning of a dynasty because not only did it win the inaugural season, but he's going to be competitive at the contender tier for many, many years. And to your point, right? Like other teams I look at it, maybe like this is the difference between Yves and Ryan's team, right? Forget about the second round picks for a second, but the lack of the first on both of those teams. But a lot of the players, Ryan has so much youth that's growing in assets, right? They're accruing value over seasons. They're in great situations. And I just feel like, and he also bought players like Amari Cooper on the cheap, right? Like, and now he's probably finding himself in a better situation to be
easy. It wasn't that cheap. Come on now. Don't throw that on.
But, I think he's got a lot of those players, that he's got on his roster that is going to continue to accrue. And I just feel like, the professional team, and I'm a bigger NBA fan than NFL. So the professional team that I sort of like comes to mind for me on this is like the Warriors. Like he's just going to be reloading if he needs to. And it's going to take an off season for him to reload. If there was like assets that he wants to trade away. You have some top end talent, like a Dalvin Cook that's more injury prone maybe, but you have players that are ready to step up. Right. And he's got enough assets that he can tool to remain not even competitive, remain a contender.
Yeah, I mean, that's a
many more years to come.
That's a great analogy. Like the Warriors obviously have their top end talent deep, and then they get young guys. They have Wiseman on their bench, who's a top of pick. Getting Kuminga, like it's just luxury at this point. Anything he can acquire feels like a luxury because he's built his team so well and knows his direction, knows his timeline, knows what he's trying to do with it. Yeah, I mean, I can't say anything negative.
Yeah, and I think, I sort of think about this, which is you with like the 14 first round picks, for example, and the all the seconds that you do have. I almost look at it as from a dynasty format. I wouldn't accept the trade if I'm Ryan to just swap rosters just because of like all the assets that he has,
Yeah, I mean, his team is kind of my 3 years down the line where I'd like to be, right? Like I'm not. It's hard to find a Jalen Waddle. It's damn near impossible to find a Jamar Chase. Like he's not tied to his running backs. If Dalvin Cook goes down, he's got a young guy to insert in there. Like his timeline is fluid. Like he doesn't. It's very different than your team. You're hitched to your running backs. Like Ryan is able to just like retool on the fly, but you have to have those assets to be able to do that, right? Like next year he's going to be maybe looking at a quarterback void, but at the same time, you plug in one guy you already have, you have someone that can probably step in and get you by and still make you a contender, but you have a ton of stuff on your bench that you can throw out there and some picks and stuff and get that solid quarterback. So at this point, I mean, he said it perfectly. Yeah, I mean, I would happily, if he wants to trade rosters, he can have all my picks.
So maybe looking at the season end predictions for Ryan, we talked about earlier on with the earlier segments around Kyle and my roster sort of being the two. Looking at this roster, like thinking through it again, I just feel like for me the contender tier is 3, and it's any one of the 3 can be the highest scoring, and also I would give the edge to Ryan in terms of the dynasty outlook over Kyle as well. How do you sort of see where Ryan is going to find himself at the end of the season?
Yeah, so the easiest way to look at this is in tiers. So I have the same top 3 as you. To me, it's night and day. Like there's a lot of space between 3 and 4. I do have Yves in that 4 spot by himself. I think he's kind of in that tier of his own. It's kind of like I'm established in the playoffs until someone dethrones me thing. And then, I think you alluded to this. I think we're on the same page here. Basically, 5 to 7 is pretty interchangeable. At this point, I give the edge to John. I think John is in the position to make some moves to be able to be the guy that knocks Yves off, more so than Sergey, who's kind of committed to this roster. But I think Sergey can make all of these guys are kind of interchangeable to me. They're followed, a little bit further by Adam, but at the same time, wouldn't shock me to see him be the one that could make some moves. And then obviously we have the rebuilding tier. Although, if we do some sort of analysis after our rookie draft, I think, there could be some more positives looking at my team. I thought Kyle's suggestion today about, there being punishment for anyone that loses to my team. I agree wholeheartedly. I think there should be some serious shame for anyone that loses to this team the way it's constructed right now. But I'm hopeful that, this will at least not look like a blatant tank come week 1. But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, again, like let's start off with sort of the tiers. So maybe the top tier seems like we're sort of finding consensus in no order, sort of Kyle, Ryan, and my team Trust the Process. And then a big disparity and gap, and that's sort of separating the Yves, John, Sergey, where you have sort of, and Adam, I guess, and then you have John sort of being the favorite to win in that second tier to see into the playoffs, and then you got yourself at the bottom there.
Yep, correct. I mean, I have my dynasty rankings too, although those are so fluid. But
no, let's talk about. I want to hear your dynasty rankings too. I mean, just for the dynasty outlook, I think we're looking at 3 years. It's hard to predict 5 or 6. So, what will be predictions this time when we do the same report in 2025? What are going to be the tiers that we're looking at that point?
You'll be at the top for every single year. I think going forward. I think moving into next year, I think every year for probably the next 4 or 5, you're going to be the team to beat. You still have all those, draft picks to be able to keep acquiring young talent. So that you're kind of my 1A. I still have Ryan as my 1B. And I just went into it in length, so I won't keep battering that. But this team is easily built up to continue to retool, continue to be there. I think 3 years from now, it'll be me and Kyle kind of battling it out for those 3 and 4 spots. That might be wishful thinking on my part, just given, who knows how long it takes some of these guys to develop. But 3-4 years, maybe 3 is a little early, whatever. But yeah, I think I'm approaching that sort of contention tier in about 3 years. 4 years. And then there's kind of a little bit of a gap for me with John. John is kind of coming in next. I think with some moves being made, John could elevate this dynasty stock. But as it stands right, just given, not a surplus of draft picks and not a surplus of youth, that's kind of where I stand. Then there's a pretty lengthy gap for me. So Yves kind of falls into the next spot, Sergey, and then Adam. And I think it's all the things we already talked about. All three of these teams, it's hard to understand what their timelines are. Whether it's like what they want it to be, but when you look at these teams from a third party standpoint, it's tough to see at this point. Yves obviously is kind of in the pickle there, just without his draft picks and without tradable assets. So I think this is probably the biggest candidate, like biggest blow up candidate, would be Yves, to just like kind of follow in the draft pick sort of strategy. Yeah, those are kind of my tiers.
I think two things to note there. I think one is Yves potentially could be what you were to me this year, right? When Yves gets to a point of blowing, because he's got enough high-end talented assets that he can sort of, trade away at that time. Najee's still going to be in his prime at that point. He's probably going to be multi-first picks at that point as well. Yeah. And the other thing to note too is anything happens in playoffs. And right now we're in 8-team league. So we got 4 making it, but by the time we get to 10, maybe as early as next year, we're talking about 6 teams. Any given year that makes the playoffs, and anything can happen, right? So I think that's going to be a really interesting outlook. I think we're in for, seasons after this to be a ton of upsets in the playoffs, because we're talking about 3 rounds versus just 2, right? And anything can happen in any given week, as we saw last season. Even the worst team in the roster, think about like Ben's roster last year in the mid-season, where he was just the bottom of the bottom, but he had that blow-up week where he scored actually the league high. He was the only team to go over 200 points last year. So anything can happen. And if that happens in the playoffs, doesn't matter who you are, it's going to be hard to put up 200 points no matter what roster you have.
Yeah, I think it's important to note too. I mean, going into the final week of the regular season last year, there were 8 teams that had the chance at making the playoffs. There were 4 teams going for the last 2 spots. We were talking tiebreakers. We were talking all sorts of things. It all worked out for you and me, but I mean, it was hairy there for a while. And those are 2 teams that had all those injury issues, had all the depth issues, that just missed the playoffs. And like you said, anything can happen once you get in. All it takes is 1 week of 180 and you've knocked off the top seed. So, I think every year as we continue to grow, as these teams, and our managers continue to kind of figure out their timelines, it's only going to increase the parity. Like we're only going to, have less top heavy sorts of leagues. And I think we're well on our way to that already.
Yeah, man, all that talk of Dynasty and everything just gets me really excited about our season 2 coming up ahead. I'm excited about the roster of the managers we have this season for us. I'm excited about us continuing to make improvements to that, so we can continue to have this level of activity that we've seen this offseason. Man, I haven't been part of any fantasy team or any league with this amount of activity. And that's one of the reasons I love Dynasty format so much. I'm loving it more and more and more that we're in. And hopefully with their new managers, Sergey and Kyle, experiencing Dynasty for the first time, they're going to fall in love with this format as well. And just that sort of as a precursor to sort of the years ahead, as we add more managers, I'm just excited for it, man. I just want to sort of, on behalf of you, Brandon, and me as the sort of the co-commissioners of the league, I just want to say thank you to all of our league managers. I'm excited to, continue with this league. And I'm excited to see you guys for the lottery pick coming up next Thursday. I think that's going to be really, really fun. Brandon, just to sort of give an update there. Brandon, I believe now you have still the second best odds. That's tied with me, right? And so Adam's got 4 balls. I've got 3 total. Or sorry, Adam's got 5. I got 4 total. John's got 3. And then you got 2 plus 2 from Kyle and Sergey, was going to net you the second best odds at 4 alongside me. A lot of top end, talent. So I'm excited for the lottery coming up ahead. I'm excited for the in-person draft that we'll be having on early August. So check your calendars for that, and looking forward to seeing you all in person. Excited for this season.
Yep, I'm excited too. And I know we have some surprises in store coming up. We're not going to share too much information, I don't think, about that, but just want to give a thanks to Yves as well. Yves is kind of the behind the scenes guy that's been our resident designer and, putting the touches on this league that make it take it to the next level, make us seem like, you know, we're the real deal. So yeah, want to give a big shout out to Yves for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Yves, for honestly just adding the extra elements that moves the needle to just make things feel more official and more fun and more high quality all across the board. So, all right. So let's sign off here. It's been great. Looking forward to all the events ahead, and see you for our official season preview coming up ahead before the season kicks off. Bye.
Later.